Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into something genuinely fascinating. We're taking one of the most famous stories in human history and looking at it through the lens of a forensic historical crime scene. We're talking about the biblical 10 plagues of Egypt and how they might actually be the result of a catastrophic ecological cascade.
The 10 plagues of Egypt are one of the most dramatic sequences in the Bible. Scientists now believe most of them can be explained by a single event, a volcanic eruption 1,000 kilometers away, and an Egyptian document in a museum in the Netherlands may be an eyewitness account. That exact quote perfectly sets the stage for the rigorous scientific investigation we're embarking on today.
Before we map out the whole timeline, let me hit you with 3 rapid-fire facts just to put things in perspective. First, that Minoan volcanic eruption on the island of Thera, it triggered massive ash clouds from a full 1,000 kilometers away from the Nile Delta. Second, cutaneous anthrax, which scientists think caused the 6th plague, carries a brutal 20% mortality rate if it's left untreated. And third, despite how massive these events were, we are dealing with a massive dating gap in the historical record between the text and the physical evidence.
So here's our roadmap for how we're going to scientifically unpack this ancient mystery. We'll start with the papyrus and the text. Then we'll dive into the Thera cascade theory. Next, we'll decode the plagues scientifically, pathogen by pathogen. After that, we'll look at the archaeological silence. And finally, wrap up with 3 open questions.
Okay, let's jump right into part 1, the papyrus and the text.
We have to start with this potential physical evidence resting right now in the Dutch National Museum of Antiquities. Let's compare the biblical text directly with the ancient Ipuwer Papyrus. On the left, Exodus chapter 7 describes the first plague saying, "All the water was changed into blood." And then on the right, look at the Egyptian text from a sage named Ipuwer. "Forsooth, the river is blood, and yet men drink of it." I mean, it's incredibly compelling, right? Some look at this and see an undeniable, independent eyewitness account of the Exodus.
But we have to be rigorous here. It's important to note that the consensus among Egyptologists is actually pretty cautious. A lot of experts view the Ipuwer Papyrus not as a literal historical record, but more as a timeless lament about societal chaos and Asiatic invaders. Plus, that chilling phrase, "the river is blood," it could have a totally physical explanation. Scientists point out that torrential flooding could have washed massive amounts of red silt, which is rich in toxic iron oxide, into the Nile, literally making it look like a river of blood.
Which naturally brings us to part 2, the Thera cascade theory.
Researchers have proposed what's basically an ecological domino effect. One disaster triggers the next. First, that massive mid-2nd millennium BCE eruption on Santorini ejects tons of reddish, sulfate-rich ash. Second, that toxic ash drops directly into the Nile. Third, the water becomes highly toxic, killing off the fish. Fourth, amphibians, like frogs, flee the toxic water for land, but then they die anyway. And fifth, all that rotting biomass creates the absolute perfect breeding ground for unprecedented swarms of insects. It's like a horrifying natural Rube Goldberg machine.
But wait, there is a complementary climatological theory that is just as fascinating. It's called an ENSO-teleconnection. Basically, this is an anomalous climate warming event. If a weird, unseasonable El Niño warmed up the eastern Mediterranean, pushing water temps over 20 degrees Celsius, it could have easily triggered massive red tide algal blooms in the Nile Delta. A red tide would literally turn the water bloody red and incredibly toxic, kicking off that exact same deadly ecological cascade.
Let's move to part 3 and decode these plagues scientifically. We're going to map out the precise pathogens.
When you treat this like a historical crime scene, you can actually map the plagues to hard science. Plague 1, the river of blood, aligns perfectly with a red tide caused by microorganisms like Alexandrium minutum. When that toxic water killed the fish and forced the frogs ashore, those decaying bodies led directly to plagues 3 and 4, absolute explosions of biting insects like midges and mosquitoes. And here's the thing, these insects aren't just annoying, they are serious disease vectors. They spread pathogens straight to the livestock.
And that brilliantly explains the 5th plague, which the Bible describes as a grievous pestilence killing off the livestock. In scientific terms, this was very likely an epizootic outbreak. Because of the swarming insects and totally contaminated environment, a massive epidemic swept through the grazing herbivores. Modern researchers actually point to gastrointestinal anthrax as the primary suspect for this devastating die-off.
Now let's see how this builds directly into the 6th plague, because this is where it gets wild. Forensic theory asks, what did the Egyptians actually do with all those dead infected animals from the 5th plague? Well, you can't just bury them. Anthrax spores survive in the soil for years and get dug up by scavengers, so they likely burn them in huge furnaces. But the blood of those infected animals contained billions of bacilli. When exposed to oxygen and heat, they turn into incredibly resilient spores, meaning the ashes left in those furnaces would have been absolutely teeming with viable, deadly anthrax.
So what happens next? The book of Exodus says Moses took handfuls of ashes from the furnace and threw them into the air. By spreading those spore-filled ashes, it created a devastating cutaneous zoonosis, a disease that jumps from animals to humans. This perfectly matches the painful boils and black ulcers of the sixth plague. And like we said earlier, untreated cutaneous anthrax has a 20% mortality rate. Some medical historians have even pointed out that this deliberate spreading of pathogenic dust makes this event, well, potentially one of the earliest recorded instances of an airborne bioterror attack.
All right, moving into part 4, the archaeological silence.
While the science of the ecological cascade is solid, we have to talk about a major hurdle in this investigation: dating it. Matching these events to a specific historical date is highly contested. The Ipuwer Papyrus dates back to the Middle Kingdom, ending around 1630 BCE. But biblical chronology places the Exodus around 1446 BCE, the so-called 15th century early date. Meanwhile, a ton of modern scholarship argues for a 13th century late date during the reign of Ramesses II. These three conflicting timelines create this profound archaeological silence, making it super difficult to pin this scientific cascade to one confirmed moment in time.
Adding another layer to the mystery, why were the Israelites largely spared from these plagues? The answer probably comes down to geography. The Israelites lived in the land of Goshen, which was located further inland, away from the coastal plains and the immediate branches of the Nile Delta. Because of that specific inland location, Goshen might have sat completely outside the focal climate change boundary of that localized ENSO warming event, or missed the direct path of the volcanic ash clouds. They likely survived simply because they were geographically insulated from the domino effect.
Which brings us to our final section, Part 5, 3 Open Questions.
Because good science doesn't just give answers, it asks better questions. Despite all our rigorous forensic work, we have to embrace the ambiguity here. First, what was the true primary catalyst? Volcanic ash from Thera or an unseasonable El Niño climate shift? Both fit the data flawlessly. Second, are we totally misreading the Ipuwer Papyrus? Is it a literal historical account or just incredibly dark ancient poetry about a society collapsing? And third, until that archaeological silence is broken, which timeline is correct? The 15th century or the 13th century?
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with something to really chew on. We've just mapped out how red algae, insect vectors, epizootic outbreaks, and airborne anthrax spores can beautifully and terrifyingly explain these ancient events. But does a natural explanation make the plagues more or less significant to you? Does knowing the actual mechanics behind the ecological cascade diminish the wonder of the story, or does it make the survival and the history of it all just that much more incredible? Think about that for a bit. Thanks so much for joining me today, and keep exploring.